Whenever you're feeling kind of worried or anxious or distressed in some way, the world is your oyster in a sense of any number of different passages in the gospel which can speak to that particular experience. But one particular passage in the gospel which is often overlooked in this regard is the gospel of Matthew chapter 22, the parable of the wedding feast. So as sort of a quick recap, there's this king, he invites different people to come to the wedding feast of his son who's getting married. And there's different responses, right? So some people ignore the invitation, some people give the excuse that they're busy, and then finally some people actually kill the messengers. In response to which the king destroys those murderers, invites other people off the street to fill the wedding hall, and the wedding hall is filled. And with that, the gospel basically ends. And obviously it kind of begs the question, what's the point when it comes to the parable of the wedding feast? Well, it's important to kind of read the story on multiple levels, right? And so even though the gospel is timeless in the sense of speaking to all people of all ages, in terms of the immediate historical context, the Lord is speaking to the scribes and the Pharisees of his time, emblematic of the people of God who have rejected largely for the most part the coming of the Messiah, as a result of which the divine invitation is now extended to the people of the world to become these great witnesses of God's glory and conduits of his grace, to form the new Israel, to form the church, if you will. So that's one way to read that particular story. But in order to uncover the more practical aspect of the story, it's really important to pay attention to a certain tension in the text. And so when it comes to any of Jesus' parables, there's always a certain kind of tension in the text where the story sort of subverts our expectations. And so you expect the story to go a certain way, but then it turns out to be something else. And so in the aftermath of that revelation, you think to yourself, that doesn't seem right, that doesn't seem fair, or however you want to frame it. Now, in terms of the parable of the wedding feast, obviously the tension arises when it comes to the response of the people invited to the wedding, the response to the divine invitation. So you got to keep in mind that they're not simply being invited to some random dinner on a Thursday night, rather they're being invited to a royal wedding, a divine feast, in response to which they give the excuse that I can't come because I'm busy. I'm busy doing ordinary stuff, things that will always be there. Things like working on a farm or attending to my own business, right? So ordinary things that keep me away from rejoicing, from resting, from feasting, if you will. And on top of that, when a king presses in terms of the invitation, some people again kill the messengers, which kind of begs the question, why? Why are they so enraged that they want to actually kill the messengers who stand in place of the king? The problem arises based on how we perceive the notion of work. So certainly having a healthy work life, attending to the duty of the moment, these things are essential to become the persons that God is calling you to be. But at the same time, if you look at yourself and you look at your work and you say to yourself in a certain sense, look, I want to be busy and I need to be busy because my busyness defines my sense of identity and self-worth, well, therein lies a bit of a problem. You know, the example that comes to mind, John Paul II, he talks about the culture of death. And specifically what he says is that at the root of the culture of death is an obsession with efficiency. Now, when you hear that, you might think that might sound kind of counterintuitive, but let me kind of explain it to you. And so all of us have various gifts and talents, things that we can do perhaps better than our neighbor. And all of us have varying levels and degrees of possessions, things that we have. But here's the question, right? Do I think of myself as being worth more based on the things that I do and based on the things that I have? Now, at first you might be inclined to say yes, but you got to realize you can't have your cake and eat it too. So what if, hypothetically, the shoe's on the other foot? And so let's say, for example, you're old, or you're weak, or you're sick, or merely tired. And I can't do the things I used to do, or I don't have the things that I used to have. When you're living in that space, do you think somehow that you're worth less? Even though you might know that the answer intuitively is no, I think a lot of us believe the answer actually is yes. And that's what John Paul II is talking about. In that are the seeds of the culture of death. To illustrate this particular point, I remember once attending a priest retreat that was hosted by the Archdiocese of Toronto, where the keynote speaker was Cardinal Timothy Dolan. And I'll always remember this homily that he gave in the context of one particular Mass when he spoke about two of the more recent popes, Pope Benedict XVI and John Paul II. And in the context of the homily, he was addressing a certain point of confusion or concern which had arisen in the hearts of certain members of the people of God as to why one pope stepped down and another pope kind of hung on to the end. And he said that the common denominator with regards to both popes was that they were acting under the sense of humility and obedience and deference to God's will. And so, for example, Pope Benedict XVI is one of the most brilliant men to ever walk the face of the earth. But when he prayed into the situation, Lord, do you want me to stay on as Pope? Obviously the answer was no. And so the whole idea is like, look, I want you to entrust your life's work and your legacy to someone else, to someone else who might take it in a different direction, but once you resign, that's no longer a concern. And so, yes, I want you to step down in this particular circumstance. You see, hold that thought and think now about John Paul II, right? So throughout the course of his ministry, whether as a priest or a bishop or later on as the Pope, he was this great champion when it came to the intrinsic dignity of the human person. And so when he prayed into the situation, Lord, do you want me to stay on as Pope? Obviously the answer was yes. And more to the point, to put himself out there. Put yourself out there in the midst of the world as you struggle and die from Parkinson's disease. And you got to appreciate how difficult that must have been. I mean, even just think of yourself, right? So how many times we ourselves are self-conscious and we don't want to put ourselves out there because we feel less than 100%. Never mind like 30% or 20%. But here's the Pope, John Paul II, and again, he's invited by God the Father to continually put himself out there, where people remember what he used to be. This is a guy who used to be strong, who used to be active, he used to camp and climb mountains and ski and all these different things. And now he's old. Now he's weak. Now he's sick. Now he's drooling. Now he can't speak. He's basically dying before the world. And the whole point is that before he used to preach about the dignity of the human person using his words, but now the divine invitation was embody this message through your witness. And that's why John Paul II says that the world is tired of hearing us talk. What the world needs is witnesses. And if anyone listens to a teacher, it's because that teacher also happens to be a witness. And on top of that, that's why John Paul II very famously says that we are not the sum of our gifts and talents, but rather instead we are the sum of our Father's love for us and our real capacity to become an image of His only begotten Son, a capacity which persists in the midst of our weakness, our old age, and our sickness, and even when we are dying. Now, what's interesting is that this particular principle embodied by the life of John Paul II is actually reflected in the parable of the wedding feast, in a really subtle detail which is often overlooked. And so because it's the Word of God, it's very important to pay attention to what's included and what's not included. So if you go back to the story, there's obviously the king, there's the son who's getting married, there's the people invited to the wedding, but because it's a wedding feast, what's the notable omission? There is no bride. I don't know if you ever noticed that before. There is no bride in the context of the story, and the reason why is because the bride is the wedding guests themselves. And what this means is that they're not simply being invited to a wedding, they're being invited to their wedding, which adds a little something when it comes to the story. And so when they say to the messengers, and by extension to the king, look, I'm too busy to come because of my farm or my business or whatever, what they're saying is that I'm too busy to spend time with you, Lord. I'm too busy to be your friend. I'm too busy to marry you. And the Lord is saying that is problematic. And more to the point, the parable alludes to the fact that an important prerequisite to becoming espoused to God the Father through His only begotten Son, you need to learn to let go. You need to learn to let go of this obsession to define your sense of identity and self-worth based on your efficiency and productivity, but instead surrender to the fact that right now you are beloved and cherished. Because right now, you are sons and daughters of Christ the King. Okay, one final note, and I'll kind of end with this. So back in the day, I remember listening to this testimony by Matt Fradd, this really notable Catholic speaker, where he was basically reflecting on this prayer experience that I think he had before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament, in the context of which he was thanking the Lord for his many struggles in the context of sin and virtue. And so just to kind of paraphrase, basically what he was saying to the Lord was like, look, thank you for my selfishness. Thank you for my egotism. Thank you even for my inclination to watch pornography. And initially he thought perhaps he was being heretical, but he knew he was touching on something authentic and real and true. And then that weekend he went to Mass, and then he heard in the context of the lectionary the words of St. Paul, where he talks about the thorn in the flesh and how he boasts in his weakness, in the aftermath of which Matt Fradd said, well, I guess that's what I meant. And later on, he reflected even more deeply on the experience, and basically what he suggested was that the struggle that we all have in terms of becoming the person that God is calling us to be, it works on multiple levels in our hearts, right? And so certainly it teaches us humility. Certainly it opens up these caverns in our hearts which can be filled with the grace of the Holy Spirit. But on top of that, our struggle, this ongoing struggle, breaks down the facade. It breaks down this facade that we tend to put before other people, hoping desperately they'll accept us. And once the facade comes down, we realize in retrospect, I was acceptable all along. And therein lies the problem when it comes to building our sense of identity in terms of our gifts and our talents and our possessions, right? Because at most, this particular orientation can garner for us admiration. where people admire us again for what we have or what we can do. But if you think about it, that's not what you want. The human heart is not longing ultimately for admiration. What you long for is love. And the exceeding good news of the gospel is that the thing you long for, you already have it. And so the invitation is to simply surrender to that, to accept the fact that even right now, you are beloved and cherished. Even right now, you are seen and known and loved. And so live from that space, surrender to that reality, because it's actually true.